Luke packs a lot into this short scene. It's a scene full of joy and hope. It's one of the very, very few scenes in the Bible that has a purely female cast. There's no men involved in this at all. And it's remarkable that we'll see this as we go through Luke's gospel during the coming year. Women do have more of a role than in other gospels. But there's so much in this story that's packed in. It's full, and of course it comes on the next passage to the Magnificat, in which Mary responds with these words of great joy and hope. You know, it would have taken Mary about 4 days to get to where Elizabeth was. So it's very unlikely as a 14-year-old that she would have traveled that distance on her own. We don't know who she went with. But she stays for a few months, and then she goes back home again, and then she does the same journey again, more or less, when she's pregnant just before the birth of Jesus. So Mary, this wee 14-year-old girl, does this kind of 4-day journey each way in the space of 9 months. Quite interesting. We can't forget these background details, which are not, for me, insignificant. I have these two very different women meeting one another. You have Elizabeth, who had come to terms with the fact that she would probably never have children. And she made her peace with that. I'm pretty sure it wasn't going to happen. And then suddenly, of course, it does. So this is a lady who's, in their terms, she's probably in her mid-40s or something, maybe, as an older lady in that period of time, giving birth to a child that she had given up hope for. And we have another younger girl who's giving birth really before she should be, really. Her body's not quite ready for that yet. But these two very contrasting women, very contrasting stories, have suddenly found themselves caught up in this bigger story of God's salvation for mankind, which we have in our Hebrews reading, which Catherine read out, about Jesus being the sacrifice for us that allows us to be sanctified to God. And it's that wonderful image we have in Hebrews. This is why they choose these readings, that Jesus gave himself for us. And in many ways, Mary and Elizabeth have given themselves over to the circumstances in which they now find themselves. I've had 3 different conversations this week that had a common theme to them. And these were with folk whose circumstances, let's say, in life had changed, and there was uncertainty and so on, and they were coping with things. And the common theme was, well, it is what it is. It is what it is. Just got to kind of get on with stuff, you know? And but one of them said to me, but I hate saying that, Paul. I hate saying that is what it is. I think there should be more to it than that. And we do face a tension here in which, over the course of our lives, we find ourselves in moments like Mary and Elizabeth, in moments of great joy and hope. And certainly both Mary and Elizabeth at this time were full of the joy of impending motherhood and the hope for their sons, what kind of life they would have. I am pretty sure that neither of them guessed that their sons would end up the way they did. We often think about Mary grieving Jesus' death, but Elizabeth may still have been alive. We don't know when John died. It's possible. But she may have been getting worried when he went off to hang out in the desert all the time, wearing these funny clothes anyway, you know? And kids turning out differently than the way you wanted them to. The common theme in life, isn't it? Our jobs turning out differently, our careers turning out differently than the way we wanted them. Our health turning out differently, our marriages turning out differently, our community, our world, blimey, our world turning out differently than the way we thought it was going to do. And you have part of a story like this, we have such joy and hope, is to be able to know that that is part of the whoop and the wharf and the ups and downs of life. That is what it isness of life. But we need to learn a lesson from Mary and Elizabeth, that we don't just succumb to the is what it isness of things. So I'd like to suggest to you this morning, and to myself and those of us who are on Zoom, that Okay, Mary and Elizabeth, their ordinary lives were taken up into a very grand story. They had a very important role to play, both of them. They really did. All right, let's acknowledge that. But we as children of God really are called by God to the lives that we have. And the circumstances in which we find ourselves, often not by choice sometimes, or by choice, but we never would have done it if we know what was coming and all these things, that these, I would suggest to us, God can take these and make them into a calling, into a story that reframes and helps us to have a different take on the daily grind of our lives. That it's not just, well, this is plan D or E or F I'm on now. But this is still God's plan A for my life. That God is still present. And although, most of us were in Bishop Briggs yesterday, and it was a very, very cloudy day. I'm going to see if we can get this PowerPoint up and running now. There you go. Is that going to click on? It's a very gloomy day, very, very foggy. There we are. Very foggy. And Ian and I know Sarah Thalbeck as well, we went out for walks yesterday, and Mark got as far as Strong the Clacker, I noticed on Facebook as well, yeah. So once you got out of the fog, now the fog is there, and it was really dense in Bishop Briggs. Did it shift at all day yesterday? Would the fog here the whole day? Yeah, so fog was here the whole day, and life can be like that sometimes. We're in a really foggy patch, and it just seems to be endless, and we forget, or we take our mind back to Glasgow in the 60s and 50s and early 70s, all the peace supers that there used to be, that I never saw, but my parents go on about, and all the trams going back up to Cathcart with the guy with a flag in front of it and all that kind of thing, And life can be like that. I feel we're in a perpetual peace super. And then kind of slowly there's a wee bit of change coming in. What I want to suggest is that as Christians, I really don't mean to be pious here or anything. I really do mean this in a very real, concrete way, that the fog of our lives can be penetrated to some extent by the light and the sunbeams of God's promises. Of God's promises. And I hope you folk can see these images on Zoom as well. And by that, I don't mean that suddenly everything becomes nice overnight. I don't mean that. But the story, the poem I asked Sarah to read about the birth of Jesus from a mother's perspective, I found very powerful. Because Christmas can be a time when it's all very nice and and we kind of gloss over a lot of stuff. And we forget the burden this put on that young girl all those years ago. And that's a burden that still exists today. I've told you before, I once met a 29-year-old grandmother in Bangladesh, This is not unusual in our world today, unfortunately. Women still bearing the kind of burden of very, very early childbirth. And one of the things I found powerful about this poem was just the reality of the physicality of birth and the mess and the pain of it all. This is not, a lot of you will know this, this is not nice, neat, and tidy at all. And sometimes we long for our faith and our lives to be nice, neat, and tidy. And the fog we find ourselves in, I suggest, and I speak to myself as much as there's anybody, sometimes the fog is generated by ourselves. Because we want things to be a certain way and they're not, but we're persisting in them being a certain way. And we've got this template in our head, this kind of worldview, this mindset that persists in wanting to see things a certain way when we can't see it that way. And we're stuck with that. And it's almost like a spiritual or mental fog. And there's something about Mary's willingness to let go and get into the mess of this being a mum and the mess of seeing this teenager grow up and seeing him doing what he did later in life. That somehow into her, the fog of her life, burst these sunbeams. It wasn't neat, it wasn't tidy. When God comes into her life, it's not tidy, it's not neat. As C.S. Lewis often said, Aslan is not a tame lion. God is not a tame God. But if we hang in there, The sun can break through. And I don't mean that the circumstances change. Looking around this room just now, I know that. Circumstances just don't change. I know that. But you've got to face that fact sometimes. But somehow the Son of God's presence can be there in that situation, or at the very least, you know that somewhere the sun is shining, even if it's not shining on you today. And even if you're in Bishop Briggs on Saturday, the 18th of December, for quite a while, know that the sun will come through one day. And if it's not coming for you, it's shining somewhere. That the whole of reality is not reduced to the fog that you're in or what you're struggling with. But the way that sun comes is in this messiness, and you have the salt of a mother's tears onto the soft head of the salt of the earth. Beautiful line. Mary giving of herself. Being a Christian brings tears to us. And I would like to suggest to us this Advent, as we come towards the end of this Advent and as we prepare for Christmas, can we be hospitable to God? Can we create space in our lives for Him? In the mess and the whoop and the wharf and the fog of our lives, can we allow God's sun to shine? It will never impose Himself on us. But the way we engage, I really believe from my own experience, there are so many promises saturated in the Bible. There are stories there that are heartwarming and challenging and encouraging. There are fellow Christians that we can learn from and listen to and be encouraged by. We can just bring ourselves to church, either physically or on Zoom. We can sing songs that we may not feel like singing, but we drag it out of us. As we do that, the sunbeams might gradually come in a wee bit. And the salt of a mother's tears onto the salt of the earth. And of course, the vulgarity of birth is not honestly preached. We need to do more honest preaching. I really do try when I stand here to preach honestly to you about life, about faith, and what it means to be a Christian in the 21st century today. I'm going to put this over. So we have this wonderful image of joy. Mary and Elizabeth celebrating together. And I want us to hold on to it because joy and sadness are not mutually opposite. In this poem, you have this incredible mixture of sadness and joy. If any of you have been through birth, you know the grief and the joy that's there together, and the uncertainty that it's through it all. Because the real scandal of God, as it says, the real scandal of the birth of God lies in the cracked nipples of a 14-year-old, not in the sermons of ministers. What I do here, what we do from this preaching is important, but actually it's in the living out of things that we find God's presence with us. I'm going to put this off for a minute. Sorry about this. Not very good signal. Here we are. Hope it'll come back on again. If we look at the Hebrews reading, we see something of what the sacrifice cost Jesus, that He gave Himself over to His Father's purposes. The purposes of God for Jesus were salvation for the world. He submitted Himself to that. So Jesus took His it is what it isness. It's almost a bit like the 5 loaves and the 2 fish things, you know? Taking the is what it isness of your lives and offering it to God this Advent and Christmas thing and saying, God, please, can you find a space for yourself in here? You know? Can you bring some of your sunbeams in here? Can I look to you for trust? And it is not, and this is the challenge for us all. It is not our hope, and I've said this before, it cannot be based on particular things working out. Because some of our circumstances are not going to change. They're not. Some might, but some just aren't. We should just work with that. But being able to live with the uncertainty, being able to trust God in it, that He will walk through us, even if it isn't the way we would like it to be or wish it was. That doesn't have to define who we are, like it didn't have to define who Mary and Elizabeth were. And for Jesus, His life ended up very differently than what most people would have chosen. As we celebrate Jesus' offering of His life later on, we remember that through that offering, so much came to us, and we to share that with others. I just want to finish with just one kind of last closing thought for us, really. Jesus came because the world was a dark place. And we're called to make a difference in the world in whatever way we can. All right, are we lights? If we come to the carols by candlelight tonight, hopefully we will see some of that, being a light in the darkness. But now there are mothers all over. I'm just going to put the PowerPoint back up just for 3 more final slides here. These are some of the boys who died in the English Channel a few weeks ago. Mothers grieving in Kurdish regions of northern Iraq. Lovely lads. Who saw absolutely no future for themselves where they were, and they really didn't. And we can have lots of political debates about migrant policy, but the fact is our world is broken, it really is, when boys like this have to leave their homes. And not just boys, young girls as well. Drowning in the English Channel. Mothers grieving for their lost children, waiting for days to hear the last phone call from the son before they got on the boat, and even mothers themselves dying there. There is a darkness in our world, and this Advent period is a time to remember not only the light, but also the darkness. And we have a history of mothers grieving in our Bible. Mary herself grieved. And we need to stand in solidarity. It's just great that Peter and Fiona are involved in trying to bring refugees here to Eastern Barton, so we'll find out more about that in the new year. I just wanted to put these images up, because at a time when families are gathering, and we had a wonderful family gathering last weekend. I really thank God for that, before the rules changed, But there are so many families who are broken apart at this time and grieving. And I think for us, that poem about Mary's birth, I think, speaks into this mess of our world at the moment, that God is with us, not in the neat and tidy things, but in the darkness and the chaos. Let's pray. Father God, we come to you with the is what it isness of our lives. When it is tempting to give up hope, it's tempting to just settle for not only second best, but almost 25th, 26th, 27th best. Lord, help us to offer you the circumstances of our lives. And like Mary and Elizabeth, be able to rejoice when the times of rejoicing, be able to see your presence with us in the grieving and the sadness too. Lord, help us to work through the fog that we may find ourselves, and to trust that the sunbeams of your life and your presence can be there. Not in necessarily changing things, but in simply reminding us that we are loved, that your Son died for us, and that you will never leave us or forsake us. Amen. Shall we stand now?